Okay, in this follow-up video on calculations with upper bounds and lower bounds, we will look at how to calculate the difference or the quotient of two numbers. Okay, in this case, really important is that for the difference and the quotient, to get the lower bound of the difference, you must have lower bound minus upper bound. And the same counts for divide. Right? And then to get the upper bound for the difference or the quotient, you have upper bound minus or divide by the lower bound. So once again, people, this you must just simply learn to remember, because that is what you must always use when you are asked a difference or when you are asked a quotient. Okay, I'm using the same numbers as the previous video, which makes it just simpler, people. We have got 4.8 minus 2.3. They're telling us that it was rounded to one decimal point. We then calculated our limit. Remember, underline the digit to which it was rounded. Make that 1. Okay, then put in zeros. Divide that by 2, which in this case gives us 0.05 as the limit. Then for the lower bound we subtracted, and for the upper bounds we added this to the original numbers. I'm not going to discuss this any longer. If you can't remember that, please watch the previous two videos on limits of accuracy. Alright, now if you have to calculate the difference, remember now we must have the lower bound minus the upper bound, which actually gives us the lower bound. So I want you to look at the way I write it. I prefer you to write LB and UB underneath each other for the two numbers like that. Okay, and then for getting the lower bound, you must use the lower bound first and then the upper bound second. Okay, and that gives you the lower bound for the difference, which means in this case we will take the 4.75, which is the lower bound, and we will subtract the upper bound, which is 2.35. And if we calculate that, we get 2.4. All right? Then, remember, this is now the difference. For the upper bound, you must actually use the upper bound minus the lower bound. Okay? The upper bound minus the lower bound. And if you now look at this one, here it is upper bound minus the lower bound. That gives you the upper bound of the difference, right? So this is a nice way to remember that it actually goes over cross if you keep on writing it that way. So now we're going to use the upper bound, which is 4.85, minus the lower bound, which is 2.25, and if you calculate that, you will get 2.6. So our difference will be greater than or equal to 2.4, or it will be less to 2.6. Okay, we can now use the same numbers for working out the quotient, which is division, isn't it? All right, so we've got 4.8 and we've got 2.3. I'm going to write down again, neatly underneath each other, let me just quickly write that down. 4.8 divided by 2.3. Okay, the lower bound is 4.75. The upper bound is 4.85. And then for 2.3, the lower bound is 2.25. And the upper bound is 2.35. Right, and now for calculating the quotient, let's go back there, quotient. The lower bound is calculated by the lower bound divided by the upper bound. Okay, lower bound divided by upper bound. Right, and if we take the lower bound divide by the upper bound, it's over cross, giving me the lower bound. Okay, 4.75 divided by 2.35, and that gives you an approximated number of 2.0212. It is a rounded number. Okay, and then if we look at the upper bound, then again the upper bound divide by the lower bound, upper bound divide by the lower bound. If we look at this, it's upper bound divide by lower bound gives me the upper bound. So that is 4.85 divided by 2.25, and again when we calculate that, it gives us an approximated number of 2.1556, a rounded number. Okay, so again, people, if you do minus or division, you need to just simply remember, you have to know this, okay? That you must always know. So for the difference or the quotient, the lower bound is calculated by lower bound minus or divide by upper bound. And the upper bound is calculated by upper bound minus or divide by lower bound. And just as a reminder, for the sum or the product, it is lower bound plus or minus times lower bound. And for the upper bound, you will calculate upper bound plus or times upper bound. Okay, I hope you understand this and that you can do your work.